Welcome, everyone. My name is John Tsulis. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI here at Oxford University. And it's a pleasure this evening to be discussing a new and important collection of essays entitled Democratize Work, The Case for Reorganizing the Economy, edited by Isabel Ferreras, Julie Batilana, and Dominique Meda. As a director of the Institute for Ethics in AI, I often say that one of the important features of AI technology is that it forces philosophers to take seriously neglected but urgent problems such as the nature and justification of democracy, or the place of work in a flourishing human life, or the relationship between work and democratic citizenship. The volume we're discussing tonight was written under the impetus of the idea that the crises which afflict us today, from the climate crisis to the health and economic crises provoked by the COVID pandemic, require a reassessment of the idea of work. In particular, they demand that we challenge the conception of work as a commodity subject exclusively to free market or capitalist imperatives, and instead that we see work as a vital site for the realization of equal dignity and rights. As Isabel Ferreras puts it in her contribution to this volume, work, the uncomfortable meeting place of capitalism and democracy, holds immense subversive power, enough power to change the world order. So we're here dealing with big stakes, no minor issues. And we're going to begin with remarks from two of the contributors. First, Isabel Ferreras, who I mentioned, who is a senior fellow at the Belgian National Science Foundation, and then Hélène Landemore, who is a professor of political science at Yale University and is currently visiting professor at the Institute for Ethics in AI. Then we will have a series of comments displaying a rich array of expertise in law, economics, philosophy, and political science from Sharon Bloch, who is professor of law at Harvard Law School, Jeremias Adams-Prassel, who is law professor at Oxford, Abby Adams-Prassel, who is a professor of economics at Oxford, and Joshua Cohen, who is a professor at the Apple University and is currently a visiting fellow at the Institute for Ethics in AI. And then, of course, there will be an opportunity for questions, including questions from people who are watching us online. So please use the chat function on YouTube to send us your questions. But now I'm going to turn to Isabel, who will give us some introductory remarks. Thanks, Isabel.
Thank you, John.
That's right, I know.
Thank you so much, John, for having us today to discuss this new book that we have out. Just let me maybe introduce the book by a comment on its particular nature. This book is out after an op-ed that we published during the first lockdown. That was May 2020, when it felt that scientists working on work had probably interesting to say about the state of work and how we treat workers and how we organize our economy. And so we published an op-ed that eventually went viral, I guess that's the word, that was signed by more than 3,000 colleagues across the globe, and that was published in many national newspapers upon the translation voluntary work of these researchers all joining to have the word out. So what's the word that was out? It's the point of the book, to unpack this op-ed. After we published the op-ed, indeed, we felt so much resonance, I guess that's the word. We felt really responsible for the words we had put out in those newspapers. And we published a book in French first, Le Manifeste Travail, unpacking the 3 principles that are at the core of the op-ed. And we did that with some colleagues, all female colleagues, working on these issues, having an expertise on these issues. We felt it was important to give the word to female scholars who are experts on these issues and who in the pandemic we started immediately to feel were not necessarily at the forefront of comments in the media. And we knew already that women were going to pay a very high price in this pandemic. So we felt it was important, and we were also very grateful for our male colleagues who understood why it was making sense to have here a series of female authors. The book was translated in many languages and now is getting out in English. It's an augmented version because we really worked on the introduction, many pieces, so to make them resonant for the English-speaking audience. We also, it's worth mentioning, we also organized last October a global forum on democratizing work, which was meant to nurture the conversation about these three principles. Because we felt that not only the book had to be out in as many languages as possible, but the conversation had to take place with not only scholars, obviously, but with the actors who are actually bearing these principles in the everyday life of societies and trying to push for change in many countries, and the global forum was entirely done online, obviously, and it was very successful. As you see, we feel a big responsibility to have this conversation going, and so we're particularly thrilled to be able to have it today. This is the table of content of the book, but I encourage you to go on the website democratizingwork.org, and you'll see all that in details. You feel that 2 years ago it was democratizing work, and now it's democratize work. So we are taking a bit of, what's the word, a bit of effectiveness or some advancing to the verb. So the starting point of this book is that labor is not a commodity, as John said. And this is actually a very old principle. It's not, we have no claim in inventing this principle. It's actually at the forefront of the Declaration of Philadelphia, which was signed at the end of World War II by the members of the International Labour Organization. This is very important because it speaks for the particular moment in which, in history, after such a tremendous crisis, the Second World War, the nations understood that if they want to build peace, they have to mind for social justice. And they have to mind for particular arrangements regarding workers, which regard in the direction of not treating workers as commodity. And so that's the starting point of our op-ed turned manifesto. Workers are so much more than resources, even though we used to speak about human resources. Now, indeed, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's the Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's indeed a totally other footing on which to build a society, an economy, and a world. But that article, obviously, it's not at the center of our economy. And so we're trying in this book to get the consequences of what it would mean to take seriously this article first, treating all human beings as free and equal in dignity and rights in the workplace. And to do that, to achieve that, we suggest that we ought to adopt, sustain, nurture three principles which have historic roots in the history of humanity. It's to democratize firms, it is to decommodify labor, and it is to decarbonize the planet. So let us now go into a bit more details about the 3 principles, and for that I'm going to ask Hélène to join me.
Hi, everyone. I'm one of the authors that Isabelle asked to sign the op-ed in the early days. I have to say I feel extremely privileged to have been part of that movement, to be able to witness the birth of a social movement from within, so to speak, especially because I felt like the beginning of the pandemic was extremely difficult for a lot of us. And so when those 3 women, Dominique, Julie and Isabelle, just seized the moment to, raise awareness, I thought that was a very positive development. So I wanted to give just a flavor of the kind of arguments we make in the book, and by focusing on the one I develop about the instrumental reasons to democratize firms. The idea, in general terms, about democratizing the firm is that we want to enfranchise the workers the same way that in traditional nation states, we've come to enfranchise categories of people who were excluded from access to political power or a say about laws and policies that rule them. So in the original manifesto, this is what was written and that I signed, issues such as the choice of a CEO, setting major strategies and profit distribution are too important to be left to shareholders alone. A personal investment of labor, that is of one's mind and body, one's health, one's very life, ought to come with the collective right to validate or veto these decisions. So the collective right to validate or veto these decisions is the philosophical principle underpinning the history of bicameralism and the social contract theory and the philosophies that have led to the democratization of our states. It's an argument that Isabelle has developed in her own work on firms as political entities. It's a history that I've revisited in my own book, Open Democracy. But it's basically a very minimal conception of what democracy means at this point. We're just setting a floor for what it means to democratize, right? Getting the consent of the governed, of the ruled, of the dominated. That's, for some people, that will not be enough, right? That's just a first benchmark. So now, assuming we want to at least do that, what are the reasons to do it? So there are the intrinsic reasons that I just mentioned. Some people would argue that there's a right to a say about the rules that govern us in the workplace and elsewhere in virtue of the respect that's due to autonomous beings, the capacity for reason and self-rule. And at a minimum, this requires informed consent to corporate decisions, but ideally it would require a lot more, such as deliberative and voting input into such decisions. Otherwise, we're facing pure and simple domination. It's an argument Elizabeth Anderson has also made, that workers today live in communist dictatorships where they're dominated and oppressed. So the way I put it in the book, I summarize that argument as the motto, no production without representation. You're not supposed to give your sweat and tears to give the care and attention that being in a workplace requires without being in turn given some rights to a say, and that often will take the form of political representation on the board of directors and all the subsequent levels of the hierarchy of the firm. But there are also instrumental reasons, and the reason why I focus on them in the book is because the people who are trying to convince are usually not that responsive to intrinsic reasons. Those may speak to the workers, they won't speak to the CEOs. Or more, I think it's harder to make that case, let's put it that way. They want to know why it's also instrumentally efficient, workable, and not a threat to profit-making and the viability of companies. So we put forward several arguments that are instrumental in nature. One is the epistemic argument, which I basically translate from my earlier work about democracies to the workplace. It has to do with the knowledge aggregating properties of taking into account the perspective of multiple people that are affected by the decisions. So it's about knowledge and diversity of views. it's basically the idea that if you include the engineers in the decisions that affect the business, you might be able to build on their intimate knowledge of the algorithm, the relationships, the more informal aspects of the workplace. And that's supposed to lead to potentially better outcomes in terms of quality of product, but also profitability. But also, and I think this whole group believes that we shouldn't measure success just by this metric of profitability, also in terms of worker mental health, physical health, happiness, work satisfaction, turnover rates, et cetera, et cetera. So indeed, the second instrumental argument is that because people are given a say, they will experience less domination at work. And one of the aspects of domination that's particularly unpleasant is the aspect that has to do with discrimination. The fact that, because you're part of a racialized group or gendered a certain way, you get less paid or treated differently. If you're given a say, these concerns will be able to be addressed and at least, voiced and made visible. The third, and another thing I should say is that I am an advocate of replacing elections with sortition. So it's something that I don't put front and center in the book because I think this is a bit of an orthogonal conversation to a degree. But I do think that there are various tracks that we could follow in terms of democratizing the firm. And I think if you follow the sortition track, meaning randomly appointing representatives or workers on boards of directors, you will get a much more diverse group. You will get a lot more women, a lot more minorities, and those have an experience, a lived experience of discrimination that they will be able to use when they make decisions about cases of discrimination at the lower level of the hierarchy. The third instrumental argument is about social justice and resilience in times of crisis. We know from, for example, the Mondragon example, a cooperative in the Basque Country in Spain, that they weathered the 2008 crisis much better than capitalist rivals because they were able to share the work hours, diminish the salaries across the board, not give golden parachutes to people who usually, tend to not blatantly deserve them, and thus sort of protect workers from the worst effects of an economic crisis. The environmental impact is another instrumental reason to care about workplace democracy. We think that it's obvious that workers who live around a factory will be less inclined to pollute the place where they live. So it's true, it's easy to make the case for local impact. It's perhaps less easy to make the case for distant impact. If a democratic cooperative ends up polluting 200 miles away, maybe it will be less of a concern. But I think there are ways to address that as well. We think it's still a mitigating factor. Finally, we think that there are spillover effects of increasing a sense of agency in the workplace. There's evidence that when people are empowered in the workplace, they become more active as political agents, and vice versa, actually. So those things are, reinforcing, and that's a good thing for our political lives, especially in times of democratic crisis. So now, how do we democratize? There are various ways to do it, but they all required one thing, which is to use the right conceptual categories. So one big achievement of Isabelle's work, in my view, is that she's been able to make a really convincing case for using categories we tend to use only for democracies as nation states or as political entities in the economic sphere. And in fact, she makes the case that we should see firms as political entities. And she also calls workers labor investors rather than resources, right? People who give of themselves and not just objectified. The second thing that we need in order to democratize is to vest workers with agenda and decision-making power. So that's where just getting the consent is not enough. I think they need to have an actual capability to shape the agenda and the choices that then they are then asked to arbitrate between. So one could imagine giving them voting rights on big-ticket issues, should we pursue a particular, the production of a particular, again, algorithm, because we're in the context of the Center for Ethics in AI, if there's a sense that this could perhaps be used for military purposes that the majority of workers disapprove of, things like that. But in most cases, this won't be a form of direct democracy. You'd have to go through representatives. And here I see two paths. One is a path of electoral democracy, replicating in the firm the sort of electoral democracy we have in the States, which I think is fairly dysfunctional. So my preference would be for lotsocratic representatives chosen by lot, or on the basis of stratified random sampling. Even if that means actually, creating different tiers of workers, on those things, I'm fairly agnostic myself. I think there are arguments to give more weight, perhaps, to certain categories of workers that have been longer in the firm. I mean, this is open for discussion. And third, the last point I'll make is that in order to to democratize the workplace, we need to create the institutions that will sustain an ecology of democratic firms. The reason why there are not that many cooperatives, although there are a lot more than people tend to think, is partly because we don't have the democratic banks, the democratic universities, the democratic business schools that are needed to really create the kind of person that's going to want to work in such a place. I'm thinking of business schools because, this is where we create this cult of the CEO, of the all-controlling genius who will accrue billions and then tell the rest of us how to spend, his donations. And I think that's the wrong mindset, but it's been so entrenched and so little questioned in our environment that it's very hard to walk that back and I think younger generations are more predisposed to a democratic mindset, but it's still something that needs to sort of be encoded in new forms of books and teachings. So I will give the floor back to Isabelle.
Thank you, Hélène. So now on to the second principle. So it's really an overview, right? And I'm going to be much shorter on the second and the third one. The second one, to decommodify labor. This means really taking seriously the idea that workers are so much more than resources, meaning that they should be able to live a dignified life by preserving their life from the forces of the so-called free market, in the sense of guaranteeing certain common good to all. That is the access to health, the access to education, obviously, and so the access to work for those who want to work. This is the Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ensuring that all those who want work have access to decent work. And one way to do this is through the creation of a job guarantee. A job guarantee is a public policy program that is pursued by the state to offer a solid floor to the labor market, in a way ensuring that no one will fall behind that level of decent work and decent wage and benefits. And in the book, we have a chapter by Pavlina Cherneva, who's the authority on this idea, and we are very interested in following up the experimentations that are actually currently going on in the world, from India to Argentina, from France to Austria and Belgium, where regional authorities, state authorities are experimenting with the idea of a job guarantee. The third principle, decarbonizing the planet. We know what happens, this is a quote from the op-ed, what happens when labor, the planet, and capital gains are placed in the balance under the current system. Labor and the planet always lose. So public authorities should set strict environmental standards. That actually we know. But including in those standards, what we say in the book is that they should include in those standards conditions of internal democratization, because a successful transition from the actual environmental destruction onto environmental recovery, at least to stop damaging the planet, will be best led by democratically governed firms. We're not able to demonstrate that, obviously, in the time that we have, and even in the book that we wrote, I'm sure, but I will let the readers say what they think about the demonstration. But in a nutshell, let me say, to summarize, that the current combination of labor commodity market, treating workers as resources exchanged on a market, combined with capitalist corporate governance, is an economic system that is extractive by design. It is extracting value from workers and from the planet in order to channel that value to those who have, the only one who have political rights in the firm, that is the shareholders who have the rights in the corporation. And that system is not going to lead us to something different, that is it's programmed to deliver it. That is extraction, more extractivism, the destruction of the planet, and the collapse of political democracy. So building an economy that is based on the three principles that we are discussing in the book is actually entirely doable. There are many actors implementing those principles. And a last point is that we argue for treating them together. There have been many movements, especially in the course of the 20th century, arguing for and pushing for one of those three principles, and where there might be some originality also in what we say, is that we propose to treat them together, to jointly address them. And that is not a sufficient condition to change the world, but it is certainly a necessary condition if we want to save political democracy and the planet. And so let me finish by saying that there are many encouraging developments underway. We are in a very tough moment, I think, now, coming out of this pandemic and seeing the state of the world, of our democracies, of how the state of the planet. And there are really encouraging developments in European countries as across the globe. Let me just say that a major trade union, industry all, a major European trade union, but also organized as a global union, has just published a new manifesto tying the three principles together. That's very encouraging. The Minister of Labor in Spain has been visiting Germany last month to dig deeper into the idea of democratizing the firm, and has announced that's her next point on her reform agenda. So this is only to mention two instances. I'm sure we're going to mention other ones because so many things are currently taking place, a bit under the radar. It's not yet on the first page of the Financial Times, but one day for sure it will get there. So thank you so much.
And thank you for including me in this event. I'm really thrilled to be here, my first time in Oxford. Preparing for this event took me back to the early days of the pandemic when Isabel first explained the idea for the manifesto or the op-ed to me. And it was obviously a very fraught and scary time. But there were a few things in that time period that provoked some optimism. Obviously, we saw essential workers, so low-wage workers, be recognized as essential, and their value recognized really for the first time. In the United States, we had this multiracial coalition that came into the streets as a result of the tragedy of George Floyd's murder to catalyze what at least we then thought was a long overdue racial reckoning. And thousands of people, as Isabel mentioned, signed on to the Democratizing Work manifesto. And even the labor lawyer in me had a small bit of optimism about labor law in the United States, and that's not easy to come by. Around the same time as the op-eds came out, my colleague at Harvard Law School, Ben Sachs, and I released a report that was the culmination of a 2-year-long project that we called the Clean Slate for Worker Power Project, the point of which was to make public recommendations for how to completely rewrite US labor law in order to create a legal infrastructure that would allow workers to build a more just economy and democracy. So as you can just hear in that description, very much aligned with the ideas that were in then the op-ed and now in the book. And the reason why we felt you had to completely rewrite US labor law is our labor law in the United States has long ago ceased to advance that project at all. And so we put out these recommendations. It was 2020. We were in the midst of a highly contentious presidential campaign, and Professor Sachs and I were actually invited to speak with almost all of the candidates who were vying for the Democratic nomination. Not all of them, surely. There was one we definitely didn't hear from. And then Joe Biden was elected running on a platform to be the most pro-labor president in history, and brought with him a Democratic majority in both houses of Congress. And so my little spark of optimism continued during 2020. But to state the obvious, it's been a really long 2 years. It has been hard to maintain any optimism, but the progress and the recognition and sort of the building momentum behind this book has been something, I think, that has made me more optimistic. And that's why I'm so glad to be here and to do whatever I can to support the dissemination of this book. And it is very much aligned, as I said, with our proposals in the Clean Slate Project. So what I wanted to share with you now are a few of the key recommendations from that project and explain how they relate to these 3 core principles to give you some idea of our vision of how you can translate these principles into a new labor law in the United States. So as I said, one of our recommendations is to completely scrap the labor law that we have in the United States. It's known as the Wagner Act or the National Labor Relations Act for those of you who aren't familiar with it. One reason to start over is that the origins of US labor law are racist and sexist. There are explicit exclusions from the law for agricultural and domestic workers, and those exclusions were included in the law to win the votes of racist Southern senators. I mean, it was just a straight transaction in order to get the law passed. And so I would say any law with that legacy is sort of inherently suspect. So we believe that a new labor law is needed to be inclusive. You can't have democracy without inclusion. To both include those categories of workers who are explicitly excluded, but also to take account of the informal economy and those workers now treated as independent contractors. The other reason to start over, again, is that the law in the US is utterly failing. And I think that's probably obvious to most, but just to give you one statistic that really makes this case. The percentage of American workers who are members of unions is lower now than before the National Labor Relations Act passed. Put another way, workers were more likely to be union members in the US when they had no right to do so than they are now after more than 80 years of a federally protected right. All right, so how do you do this project? One key recommendation that we made is to have US labor law move to a sectoral bargaining system. As Isabel discusses in her chapter of the book, that sectoral bargaining is key to decommodifying work. As we've seen in recent decades in the US, a collective bargaining system built on a workplace by workplace bargaining creates a race to the bottom in anything other than the very tightest of labor markets. It also creates a very powerful incentive for employers to fight unionization, leading to widespread flouting of the law. As you may have heard, the National Labor Relations Board, which is the agency in the United States that enforces our labor law, just accused Starbucks of committing hundreds of labor law violations in just the organizing campaigns in Buffalo, New York. I mean, Buffalo is just a little city, and they racked up hundreds of violations. And that's not an unusual response by corporations in the US to unionization campaigns. But to get to a place where sectoral bargaining would be possible and effective, a lot of other reforms would have to be put in place. We would need to make organizing easier. Now, under US labor law, employers can force workers to listen to anti-union speeches over and over and over again, and they can run extensive anti-union campaigns that can drag on for a long time. They can fire pro-union workers and delay putting them back to work while they fight disingenuous legal battles up and down the courts. And so we recommend making the organizing process fairer by making it less subject to employer domination. Another reform that we recommend that speaks to the principles in the book is our recommendation to expand the topics over which workers have a right to bargain once they have a union. Under current US law, workers generally have no right to bargain over so-called managerial decisions, even when those decisions have a profound impact on their experience of work. They can even be fired if they strike in an effort to influence bargaining over those kinds of subjects. These topics include matters that affect profitability, product choice and design, the scope and direction of the business, subcontracting, relocation or offshoring, decisions regarding capital substitution, such as automation and other major investment strategies, and implementation of algorithmic management. We think that workers should have the right to bargain over whatever decisions they believe are important, particularly those that have a direct and substantial impact on their lives. So beyond these managerial decisions, we also think to truly have workplace democracy, workers should have a right to bargain over what might be deemed the kinds of political decisions made by firms, even if those decisions do not directly impact what US law deems to be terms and conditions of employment. For example, workers in the US have demanded a say in how their firms respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. Other workers have protested their employer's decision to contract with immigration authorities during the Trump administration, and healthcare workers frequently ask for a say in patient safety protocols. But nothing in US labor law as it stands now protects workers from even making these demands, much less gives them the power to influence the decisions. So we would argue that there really is no workplace democracy when topics as important as these can be unilaterally taken off the table by the employer. So possibly the most important of these topics is a firm's carbon footprint. Workers clearly have a profound interest, as Isabel was just describing, in what role their work, their labor investment contributes to the climate crisis, but under US law now have no right to bargain over such a topic beyond their narrow interest in how it affects their work tasks. So we recommend that employers be required to bargain over any topic requested by a union that the employer has control over. So you wouldn't require an employer to bargain over solving the climate crisis, but certainly over the firm's contribution to it. So thus, expanding bargaining topics is key to both democratizing and decarbonizing work. We also endorse in Clean Slate the more direct route to democratizing work by recommending a requirement that workers serve on corporate boards. Now, at the time we put the reports out, there were several proposals pending in Congress to do just that. And the most prominent of those would have required at least 40% of board seats be allocated for workers. and not wanting to sort of undermine those efforts, although they ultimately obviously were not successful, we adopted that 40% minimum for some board decisions, but upped the ante for those decisions most important to workers. And this was sort of our attempt to incorporate at least the spirit of bicameralism by giving workers a veto over the decisions that were most important to them by recommending that a corporate board, have to have a supermajority in order to implement policies such as closing plants, laying off a substantial number of workers, or adopting a policy that would significantly alter the share of corporate revenue going to wages. So those are just, it's a 100-page report, so we've got lots and lots of recommendations, but I think those are the ones that are most key to sort of the principles in the book. But I just want to conclude by answering a question that some of you may be thinking, listening to somebody talk about labor law from the United States. And you might be thinking, doesn't the organizing at Amazon and Starbucks that is getting a lot of attention demonstrate that US labor law is finally working? And I just want to say there is no doubt we are experiencing in the US the most exciting period of union organizing that I've ever seen. And the surge in organizing is happening at companies that many had thought, I mean, not just that they were not democratic, but that they were unorganizable. And so this organizing is important and inspiring, and it is making a difference. You have a very different feel and energy around the labor movement in the US right now. But I want to share Isabel and Helene's optimism, but I do have to caution that we still really need a new labor law for two reasons. First, we don't know what the outcome of all of this organizing is going to be. It's being driven in part by a tight labor market, the tightest labor market in the US that we've seen in a very long time, but that might not last that long. The Federal Reserve is already taking steps to rein in the economy, which will likely, I mean, that is the point of doing this, is to create more slack in the labor market because we do have a commodified work under our legal system. And so, you know, the Fed is moving now to try to raise unemployment. But more importantly, I think this organizing, even though it's being successful, just underscores the fact that it shouldn't be this hard to achieve these principles, these very, very powerful principles that both our project and the book are based on. So Christian Smalls, who is the organizer who's leading the Amazon organizing in Staten Island that was successful, during that campaign, he was fired, he was arrested, he was defamed by the company. The union that he leads, which is an independent union, won the election at that plant by hundreds of votes, and yet he still hasn't sat down at a negotiating table with the company, and he very well likely will not for years to come if Amazon chooses to fight the outcome of the election through the courts. And the same is true at Starbucks. Clearly, these are companies that have the resources to take this fight as far as they can, and they have every incentive considering the makeup of the Supreme Court in the United States right now. And this is all happening at two companies that became bigger and richer during the greatest public health crisis, you know, that the globe had seen. And we come out of that experience, if in fact we are coming out of it, with greater income inequality than we went into. So how do we get there? This is like a beautiful vision. You may have noticed that the US Congress is not particularly good at passing big, new progressive laws these days. But I think there are two answers to this. I'm trying to drum up some optimism. First, I believe we need to give voters a reason to vote for big progressive change, to let them see what a new labor law, what democratizing work would actually look like and how it could change their lives. In the US, our labor law is a federal law, and it doesn't allow much space for sort of experimenting with empowering workers at the state and local level. And so in our next step in the Clean Slate Project, we want to look at where that space is to try to encourage more experimentation at that level, to see if we can help states and cities bypass some of the congressional gridlock and experiment with policies that would democratize work. So I'm going to stop for there, but happy to answer any questions about sort of how these issues are playing out in the U.S.
Thank you so much. So to a more European law perspective, Jeremiah.
Thank you. And thank you hugely to you for a brilliant and stimulating book. And what I particularly like about it, it's always easy to diagnose a problem. It's much harder to then sit down and say, what should we actually do about it? And I think one thing I like about the manifesto, and particularly then the worked out version in the book, that actually says, we're not just going to say, here's a problem, we're actually going to say, here's some very concrete things we're going to do about it. In fact, the same thing is true, the same compliment should be paid to the Clean Slate Project, because I remember studying at HLS under very young Ben Sachs in his very first year of teaching, and I thought to myself, if I have to read one more article about the failure of the Wagner Act, I'm going to drop this course, because everybody diagnoses the problem, nobody actually says what we should do about it. I think you too have sort of, grasped that and done it. Now, I look very fittingly to the Institute itself at AI and the future of work. But very specifically not at what happens with AI and workers' jobs and this whole sort of, frankly pointless debate about AI and workers' job losses. What I'm interested in is what happens when management gets replaced, or at least gets augmented by artificial intelligence and automation systems. And interestingly, the big laboratory for all of that was the gig economy. And that's why I was very pleased to see labor's not a commodity on your screen earlier. Because actually, one of the things that first struck me about the gig economy was that Amazon MTurk, one of the big early platforms for gig work online, when Jeff Bezos introduces MTurk at MIT in the early 2000s, he goes on stage and says, we've cracked storage as a service, we've cracked computing as a service, the next thing I'm introducing today is humans as a service. And as a labor law professor sitting there, seeing the CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the world saying, we're now, as of today, going to sell humans as a service through MTurk, my first thought was, of course, labor is not a commodity. Declaration of Philadelphia, going all the way back to the Treaty of Versailles. So actually, I think that was one of the most jarring contexts and how it really ended up with humans as a service for thinking about the gig economy, that within the space of less than a century, we've gone from all these high contributing parties agreeing that's not the case to saying, actually, the future business model is precisely what you said is not going to happen. Now, of course, for present purposes, the really interesting thing then is what starts in the gig economy moves to labor markets across the socioeconomic spectrum. So this notion that you managed, controlled, surveyed by an automated decision-making system started for Amazon warehouse workers, started for Uber drivers, etc. Today is true for workplaces across the socioeconomic spectrum. No longer matters whether you work in a university, in a law firm, any kind of white or blue-collar job. These kind of systems and techniques first trialed in the gig economy now come to just about every workplace. And I think that thing, if anything, the one sort of, very, very slight but very positive criticism I would make of the book is that, if anything, you understate the challenge we're now seeing. Because actually, when I start thinking about the kind of work we do, looking at the implications of AI, automation, automated decision-making system for work, across each of your three challenges, it's bad news. Each of the three categories you identify, AI is going to make things seriously worse. So look at firm government, right? These challenges of exercising control. Well, actually, AI systems in the workplace now let you exercise control to a degree of intensity and granularity that even Taylor couldn't have possibly dreamt of, right? The sort of the cheapness, the effectiveness, the tailoring of which we can now control workers is incredible. And it's not just these sort of information asymmetry that drive this, it's fundamentally also a problem for management. And so in the work that I do with colleagues here in Oxford, Aisling Kelly-Lyth, Halafom Abraha, and Sig Silverman, we also think very much about this loss of agency on the management side as a fundamental challenge. Because we talk about controlling corporations, right, sort of starting with this idea of bicameral boards, but ultimately that's the idea of shareholders being able to control the agency that management has in terms of running the firm. Well, what do we do if management no longer has that agency. One of the earliest cases litigated in Baltimore was actually an anti-unionization case against Amazon, where the allegation was essentially sort of straightforward, you know, a few people tried to organize a trade union, you sack them. Amazon's ultimately successful defense was to say, these guys were all sacked by an algorithm. Local management neither understands nor has any control over the system that actually terminated these workers. In the context of the NLRB system, that's actually a really good defense. In the context of thinking about democratizing the firm, that's really deeply problematic, because even if you democratize the management thing, if management then turns around and says, I've got no idea what this algorithm does or how it works, or what it is, well, where are we going with this, right? So firm management, huge challenge. Decommodifying labor. Again, I think what big automated management systems doing is drive the exact opposite, right? Taylorist fantasies never really worked. They didn't work precisely because of the huge transaction costs involved. You can't have a manager standing behind every worker, you know, taking notes on the clipboard, telling her precisely what to do. Just too expensive. Well, that's gone now. You can have a single bit of software running taxi operations or delivery operations in countries across the world. So again, when you talk about commodifying labor, actually, you can now do this more cheaply, more efficiently, more effectively than even Taylor could have ever dreamt of. And going far beyond my areas of expertise now, again, you look at the environmental implications, you know, you look at some of the literature on the carbon footprints, the energy requirements to train a lot of these systems, far beyond my expertise, but huge implications. Now, having set out the problems, I'm going to at least try and make a feeble attempt for at least one of those, my particular area of interest, firm government, to think about sort of solutions, right? And what can we do about this? And in a sense, it takes me right back to sort of my doctoral studies when I was looking at how firms were using corporate setups and complexity to essentially avoid responsibility. Now, the big challenge with automation is that the evasion of responsibility isn't no longer anymore just a legal trick, right? As long as Uber puts in self-employment clauses in their contracts, or, you know, a hedge fund uses various shell companies to avoid responsibility, well, those are legal tricks. So at least in principle, we've got legal answers to them. When that evasion of responsibility, through this lack of agency on part of management, becomes inherent in the technology itself, as a law professor, I'm starting to get slightly worried about what we're going to do about it. I think that's the real challenge. And I think that, in terms of the programmatic agenda for how the law thinks about regulating these systems, is how can we reestablish agency, right? And I mean, Isabel, you've done some really interesting work on this in the past as well, these sort of, you know, various layers of how we think about the firm. But I think the real and fundamental challenge here is that we need to establish agency in order for the democratization of firm management actually to be able to work. Now, I'm not all gloomy about technology, right? Technology can re-establish agency. So just as much as technology has been used to atomize work, well, lots of clever organizing in the gig economy actually harnesses the very same technology. A recent proposal by the European Commission for a directive on platform work specifically includes access rights for workers' representatives to the technology used to manage their workers. Right? So I'm not at all negative. Again, I think we have to be careful. This is not necessarily about inherently the technology itself. It's about how we deploy it and what kind of forms of technology we're allowed to be deployed. But I think fundamentally, from where I'm sitting, I completely agree with you. I would say you have, if anything, undersold the kind of challenges we're facing. And of course, the COVID pandemic has led to an explosion of all these technologies. Right? February 2019, imagine we told all workers they need to put a camera in their bedroom and their kitchen. You would have actually had, you know, unions signing up people left, right, and center in a revolution. March 2020, it's the new normal, it's the new baseline, right? So again, I think that's another important thing. What do we think of? Is the acceptable baseline the acceptable challenge? So I think let's recognize that challenge, but I think let's also think about technology as part of that solution. And the core sort of goal has been, on the one hand, dealing with these information asymmetries in the workplace that technology now brings about, but also fundamentally re-establishing managerial agency as well as workers' agency in order then to be able to attach your democratic calls to that agency. But thank you for a brilliant book.
Thanks so much. Abby Adams-Pressel.
Perfect. Well, yeah, again, thank you so much for the possibility of reading the book. As an economist in a kind of panel like this, where the theme is about decommodifying labor, and, you know, I trade in human capital, you know, in the labor market, and I think about people's outcomes as being determined by the interaction of their willingness to pay and then marginal revenue product, you might think this is, you know, I might be in slightly hot waters. But actually, the first thing I want to talk to you about today is actually how a lot of modern economics actually can be used, I think, potentially more effectively in your book, to actually bolster a lot of the claims that you make. So in economics, at least the kind that I do, has moved, I think, from a kind of world of theoretical, perfectly competitive markets into a much more empirical science, where, for example, Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, you know, she goes quite far to describe economists as plumbers now. So it's trying to actually look at what's going on in the world and actually try and empirically verify the degree to which certain policies and certain actions and actually certain power relations are actually shaping the outcomes that we see and that we care about. And so in the book, the kind of in the introduction, the authors kind of say that there are kind of three elements to how they're thinking about collective movements for change. So agitators, innovators, and then orchestrators. And what I would say is that economics does actually have something to say about all of those, but in terms of like kind of my research and also some of my involvement in policy making and evidence making over the pandemic, I think some of my comments are more on innovation and orchestration and the degree to which you might be able to think about economics as an instrumental tool to provide a kind of a broader coalition of individuals who might kind of get behind and support what your main thesis. So I guess I've got in that vein just three, I'll keep my comments relatively brief, but kind of three kind of broad sets of comments. Two of which relate to the level at which you focus on change being effectively deployed, given the status quo that we're actually in. So there were kind of two elements to this that I kind of picked up on in a couple of the contributions. The first is this role of the firm, and the second is this role of the state, and particularly around job guarantees. So as in Isabel's kind of contribution, like kind of her individual chapter, you know, there is, of course, throughout the book, this recognition that there are multiple levels within the labor market at which voice and at which participation in decision-making can occur, from the shop floor to maybe at a plant level, a company level, and then a sectoral and a national or kind of governmental level. Now, I would say, this kind of new, more empirical science within labor economics, when I say new, it's not actually new, but it's just, you know, it's different from the 1950s, I guess. So there has actually been a lot of recent work on the role of unions, collective bargaining, and on co-determination in actually providing both better outcomes for workers, but also for society, and even for firms in terms of profit and productivity. And there are three, if you like, kind of key takeaways from this literature, which is mainly harnessing kind of new data that we have in Germany and in the Nordic countries, which really facilitates quite a granular level of analysis. And the first, I would say, kind of key conclusion of that literature is that you really want to outsource as much of this conflict away from the plant and firm level itself, which goes completely to your comments as well around the kind of the benefits of sectoral bargaining. You're much more likely to achieve better outcomes for a wider group of individuals if you're focusing more on an industry region level rather than on the kind of plant level. The second kind of key conclusion is that you want as much as possible to try and decouple bargaining coverage from workers' individual unionization status. Because this actually kind of reduces, as you were saying, it reduces individual employers' incentives to actually actively fight that unionization, okay? And I mean, I think, again, I'm not a philosopher, but it would be quite interesting perhaps to actually think about then that role between that decoupling, if you like, from the unionization, perhaps from the agency of workers and the participation of them in particular levels of kind of decision-making processes. At least from kind of my plumber's perspective, it does seem that there's some things to be worked out there, even if the data that we have at the moment would suggest that that leads to kind of better outcomes given the status quo that we're in. And now the final thing, which of course kind of goes throughout the book, is that the more to which we can institutionalize worker management cooperation through co-determination and through formal processes for giving voice of workers, the better. So I guess there's the new research director at very, in a sense, quite traditional labor economics group in Bonn called IZA, has a series of different kind of empirical papers which actually demonstrate all of these things. And the reason I wanted to bring them up was, especially given Helene's contribution in this kind of trying to be specific about the role of instrumental reasons for actually wanting to democratize, like kind of lying behind your manifesto, I thought the better. So that's kind of saying actually firms are part of it, to like kind of summarizing that, firms are part of it, but I really think, you know, it shouldn't just be about focusing on individual firms. There needs to be a kind of more systematic sectoral and industry level to your manifesto. Now, the second point at which I kind of wanted to, I guess, kind of put out some of my concerns, I guess, about the role potentially of job guarantees, or perhaps this idea of states providing jobs, is perhaps given the experience that I had with trying to participate in UK policy making over the pandemic. So this might just be a bit of a rant from me about just the kind of political system and political incentives that I feel are at work in many modern economies. So what we observe around us in the labour markets today is not just a product of free market forces. So even if we think about private actors, again, economists would be, you know, there's huge inequality of bargaining power there in terms of monopolistic power. It's not, you know, a free market by any sense. But if you actually look at, take essential workers. So in the UK context, 50% of essential workers are employed by the state. So I had a slide with the statistics. But if you look at, so it's about 50% of UK essential workers are in the public sector. And you also have a significant portion of those who are not earning living wages. If we look at social care, actually a number of those are, 80% of domiciliary care workers, when I last looked at it, are on 0 hours contracts, kind of employed through state or quasi-state institutions. And so I think that kind of points to this is not just a kind of a product of private firms maximizing profit. There's actually something kind of at a more fundamental level going on, which is shaping not just how private sector labour markets are working, but also public sector, and indeed how our kind of state and political system is organized. And so this kind of leads me to the kind of final point that I just wanted to make, which was, whilst I'm kind of, and this is actually a question, because I'm hugely sympathetic to a large number of the proposals and the diagnoses put forward in the book. But I was wondering at points whether focusing on some of these elements in the workforce itself, we're kind of dealing with symptoms and not kind of fundamental causes, and perhaps not instead of, but to complement some it felt like you needed perhaps another pillar just in terms of thinking about inequality, redistribution, and the concentration of power within modern economies. And to add to Jeremiah's somewhat, well, yeah, exactly, you're even more dismal science than I am, I guess. But I do think that some of the trends that you see in terms of the deployment of certain types of technologies is very concentration and inequality enhancing, as opposed to necessarily flattening that out. So So I'm just saying perhaps you might want a final pillar, or to kind of bring in more explicit policies to tackle that level of wealth and power inequality. And I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And our final commentator is Josh Cohen.
Great. Well, thanks, John. It's really both a pleasure and a privilege to be here. It's a pleasure because I get to be with two friends of long standing. I don't want to say old friends because I may be misunderstood. Friends of long standing, and a privilege because Isabel and Hélène have done so much in this book and in other parts of their work that it's grateful for the opportunity to be part of this with them. So Isabel says in her contribution to this important book that people spend the bulk of their hours and days working. And the largeness of work is reflected on the book's cover, where the word occurs 9 times. But with all this emphasis on work, there's not that much attention in the book to addressing what I'm going to call Nora Watson's concern. So here's a quotation. Jobs are not big enough for people. It's not just the assembly line worker whose job is too small for his spirit. You know, a job like mine, if you really put your spirit into it, you would sabotage immediately. You don't dare. So you absent your spirit from it. My mind has been so divorced from my job, except as a source of income, it's really absurd. Nora Watson was a staff writer for an organization. She was writing healthcare literature, and this comes from a conversation that she had with Studs Terkel in his book, Working. Now, to be sure, half the contributions in the book focus on, excuse me, on collective voice, that is on democratizing work, which is, if I expire, John can finish. Yeah, thank you, thanks. Yeah, I tried that already and it wasn't working, thanks. So they talk about collective voice that is democratizing, which is essential to addressing Nora Watson's concern. But what I want to do in the next few minutes is to broaden the characteristics of work that would make it big enough for people, that make jobs genuinely good jobs. And then maybe in the discussion we can explore the relationship between these features of jobs and the concerns about firm governance and decommodification that are central to the book. So I'm going to sketch 4 characteristics of good jobs, jobs that are big enough for people, or as Nora Watson also says, I love this thing that she says, these are jobs that you want to bring home with you. It's a nice, where you're not worried about work-life balance. You don't get the idea that there's 2 different, anyway. All right, so the 4. First, we have standard characteristics of good jobs, that they provide a decent standard of living, sufficient to cover basic needs, have some predictability in hours and stability in tenure to enable the person with the job to fit it into the rest of their life, that they're healthy and safe, and that they offer opportunities for acquiring new skills and responsibilities over the life course. Now, these list of features make jobs good because people are not only job holders. So these features contribute to the quality of a person's life by making a decent level of resources available, growing over the life course, and enabling some stability of expectations around resources and time. That's one. Okay, secondly, there's voice, and there are at least 2 reasons for thinking that voice and the power that grows from it are important features of good jobs. First, there's the instrumental case. So standard features of good jobs like decent compensation and health and safety, well, they can be achieved in part through legal guarantees like minimum wages and health and safety regulations, but the protection of those standard features is more secure when workers have sufficient voice in firms to ensure their local protection and to press collectively for their legal enactment. Firms don't give intrinsic weight to the benefits to workers that come from good jobs, which is why good jobs are undersupplied by markets. With worker voice and power, the protection of those interests is internalized to the firm's decision-making calculus. In addition, an intrinsic reason for including voice as a feature of good jobs, well, so that they don't involve an insulting and demeaning subordination to arbitrary authority. Arbitrary authority may be exercised gently and generously, but it remains arbitrary if it's not answerable. What makes the authority arbitrary is that there's no recognized representation of the people over whom it's exercised. They may be taken into consideration, but whether or not they are depends on the discretionary judgments of the authorities. Because of this dependence on the arbitrary discretion of an authority, a job that lacks voice has a demeaning quality. There's an insult to the dignity of the job holder. This, by the way, this has some resonance with the kinds of things that Liz Anderson says about jobs and power, but it's really a different concern. This is not about the legitimacy of the authority. It's about the demeaningness of the position. Third, purpose. So voice and those standard goods that I listed first are important, but something is missing from them that's arguably essential to a good job, namely that a good job involves work that serves and is understood by the person doing the job to be serving a valuable purpose, that it's not, to borrow from David Graeber, a bullshit job. Work requires time and effort, spend the bulk of your days and hours doing it, and it's deeply dispiriting to spend so much time and energy on activity unworthy of our efforts. Purpose also provides a basis for the kind of identification with the activity of work that's arguably needed to motivate the attention and effort needed to do a job well, because a person recognizes it as something worth expending energy on. The motivations are more autonomous than with jobs that strike the person as bullshit, that is, as lacking a real point. And more autonomous motivations appear to give better results for quality of work, health, less exhaustion, burnout, and stability of employment. Finally, and most ambitiously, there's pleasure in the work itself. In his utopian novel, Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, Edward Bellamy imagines the world in 2000, more than 100 years after the book was written. The members of Bellamy's utopia work from age 21 to 45, and everyone has jobs that provide those standard goods of good compensation, et cetera, and they serve a worthy purpose, though there's no voice. But early retirement at 45 is their great good fortune, because the world of work that Bellamy describes is dreary, modeled on military service. In a review of Bellamy's book, William Morris complained about the lack of any enjoyment in the work. As Morris put it, the true incentive to useful and happy labor is and must be pleasure in the work itself. What could that possibly mean, to find pleasure in the work itself? Well, first, a variety of tasks. Even if each task is not especially complex in itself, the sheer variety of tasks, say in systems of job rotation, creates some complexity. A person needs to adjust to a different task or responsibility, which requires a break from routine and a redirection of attention. Second, an exercise of judgment as distinct from the execution of a routine. Third, a mix of reflection and imagination, both reflection on the routines that now define the activity and an imaginative consideration of alternatives that might represent process improvements. This mix of reflection and imagination calls for a kind of practical imagination, which we exercise both in defining hurdles in the current ways of doing things and in exploring alternative directions of improvement. These are the kind of qualities that are formalized in design thinking and human-centered design. Finally, the activity requires social collaboration, a pooling and coordination of different kinds of expertise, skill, and sensibility. In collaboration, we need to consult with other collaborators, settle on a common course of action, and make regular practical adjustments in our routines. And this means that the activity depends both on a cognitive and emotional attentiveness to other people and a willingness to listen, persuade, adjust, accommodate, and sometimes insist. So we have those standard features that I mentioned first: voice, 2 reasons for it, purpose, and then pleasure in the work itself with the different dimensions that I just described. Now I want to conclude on a really utopian thought. I mean, you exercised your professional deformation. I'm a philosopher. I'm going to exercise mine now. So I'm going to land her. So imagine a world of AI amplified work, the good kind, not the bad, AI amplified work in which people collaborate in problem-solving teams with robots as augmentation, not substitution, and which jobs typically have the kind of non-routine variety of judgment and imagination that's now confined to the most productive parts of the economy. The work is highly productive because of its technological foundations, because people who do it are motivated both by purpose and pleasure, and because team collaboration provides a setting for continuous improvement achieved through learning by doing. This would be a world in which large numbers of jobs are nearly as engaging as the jobs of the people in this room. So to close the circle, what the discussion of purpose and pleasure may suggest is that the best way to achieve jobs that sustain the productivity and innovation needed to amply supply those standard goods of compensation and health and safety and growth over the life course. The best way to do that may be to aim ambitiously through public and private policies, aim ambitiously for jobs that are good in all the ways that I've mentioned here, including ones that involve pleasure in the work itself. Now, I know that Isabel, I know from many conversations that they agree with all these aspirations and that they're very much aligned with what they're doing in the book, and I hope what we might be able to do a little bit in the conversation is to explore how they fit into the Democratize and Decommodify framework that's the focus of the book.
Thank you very much, Josh. Now, I'm going to deprive the two of you of the opportunity to respond because I'm wary about going over time. And I'm going to go straight to questions from this highly intelligent and motivated audience. So are there any questions anyone wants to raise? Ashley, yes.
Thank you so much for presenting the book. This idea of workplace democratization is really interesting to me. Thank you. And I also really agree with what Jeremiah said about the importance of kind of moving beyond just the theory into the practice, which I think the Clean State Project has done amazingly well. And it was interesting to hear some of you speak about unions as a collective bargaining as a means of achieving that, and then also various mentions of corporate board participation or workplace councils and similar collective governance approaches. So I was wondering whether either the authors or any of the panelists have views on the kind of how those systems might operate either individually or in a kind of complementary fashion, the relative merits of union or collective bargaining approaches to collective governance versus workplace councils or corporate board participation as two different ways of achieving workplace democracy, either from the authors or the panelists.
Any other questions we could take as a kind of Ted? Yep.
Thank you. So I'm with you in spirit, but I want to press on the intrinsic argument for democratizing work. I think it was interesting in this talk that, well, to learn that democratization is not necessarily at the forefront of the titles in all languages, but it really does come out in the English version of the title, where it really is, democratize work. So it seems to me that, getting the arguments right, especially the intrinsic argument, which seems like the linchpin, is really fundamental. And I just wasn't entirely sure that I understood that case. So there was a human rights-based argument for democratizing work. And I thought that was interesting because some people in this room, maybe even sitting next to you, have argued that there is no human right to democracy. So I think that might be something to discuss a little bit further. And then the other question I had was, there's this voluntariness complaint. You know, one of the reasons why it's so important that we have a right to a democratic say in sort of national settings is that governments are coercive. We can't easily leave the states in which we live, and that makes it especially important that we have some say in how we're governed. Employment relationships are at least formally voluntary. If we don't like how we're being treated in the workplace, we can. It may be difficult, but we can leave. So that just makes it a little bit more difficult to argue that there really is a right to democratize the workplace. It's not impossible, but I'm just curious to hear how you deal with those kinds of challenges. Thanks.
Katia, yes.
Thanks. This was, I hope you can hear me, and this was hugely inspiring. Does it work? Yep. Yeah, great. So my comment was that I think it would be interesting to broaden the discussion of work a little bit to the dimension of unpaid work. And I think it speaks to some of the comments already made here by the members of the panel. For example, when they think about structures or how time-consuming work is, in some way, unpaid domestic work, which is very much my research interest, it kind of happens in the private spheres and the home. We can see it's not counted in the GDP, for example. It's quite often left out of the debate, and yet it had huge influence and repercussions onto the paid work. For example, in a country that doesn't have paid paternity leave, there are limits to how much democratization of the labor market you can make to encourage usually women, to come back to work early on after having children or when they have huge care responsibilities. We know that at certain stages of life course, unpaid work can be more time-consuming than paid work, for example. It's often when people have young children, and in some societies, like Japan, for example, 90% of that work is done by women. And I don't think we can solve these issues by purely looking at the work sphere. And finally, I think some of the way domestic work historically is devalued, and I think there was a big argument whether to include it into GDP calculations or not, and there was an argument that it's too complex and too difficult to measure, therefore we should not. But as a result, being sort of unpaid and uncounted, I think there's some spillover effects potentially onto the paid work valuation, and that came through in the pandemic so much, and we talked about the care workers here. Often, I think to some extent, their jobs might be devalued and be these very low quality jobs because, well, these jobs are worthless and someone could do them for free and for nothing at all. So I'd be quite interested about whether or how we could extend the debate to take that into account, the unpaid work into account.
Thank you so much. Can I make a plea for pithy responses? And also questions. And also for questions, because we've got a pretty hard deadline. So, yeah, whoever wants to pick up any of those three questions.
Okay, well, I'll be very quick then. I just want to say to Jeremiah, I think I'm going to use Josh, summary of his talk tomorrow. Don't shoot the algorithm. I'm not sure that we should, feel so disempowered just because I think it's an excuse actually to blame the algorithm and just be like, oh well, no, I'm sure we can find responsibilities, including legal ones. It's just you have to try hard enough. So I don't know. I might be wrong, but that's my instinct. And then to the question of exit opportunities. So I have to say the intrinsic argument for democracy, like all intrinsic arguments in general, I myself have some, issues. So that's why I tend to return to the instrumental case, but we have explored the various forms of arguments for democracy in the workplace with Isabel in a joint paper a few years ago called In Defense of Workplace Democracy, and the argument from exit opportunities turns out to be quite weak when you look at it in a concrete way. Yes, we all have a right to exit our jobs, but try it and see how hard it is. We're all slaves to banks. We have families to feed. We have visa issues. I mean, it's like the formal possibilities and actual possibilities of exit are very different things. So it could be that if really it's a job where the exit is costless, Maybe, indeed. You know, either you find another reason, or you consider that maybe that's not a job that grants you rights. That might be okay. But I think that the reality is often that we are substantially constrained in very serious ways, and exit is very hard for most people, especially at the lower end of the hierarchy, because of course maybe for very skilled people with very rare talents, you can move countries no problem, you can move companies no problem, but for most people it's not like that. So just
make one more point about that. So I've spent like like thousands of hours studying factories where the turnover is 6% a week. So the costs of exit are not really that high. And people who leave, there's a difference, a gender difference. Women say they leave to take care of family stuff. Men say they leave because they're getting a higher pay wherever they're going. So it doesn't seem very, but all the opportunities that are available are pretty much the same. They're all, like extremely routine, basically minimum wage jobs. So I think the availability of the exit option doesn't provide the voluntariness of the acceptance of the conditions of work with the moral significance that you may think that it has, or whether you think it or not. I mean, that was implicit in the question that you were asking. Yeah.
Are we finishing at the hour? This is the idea?
I think we can go till 10 past, but we must finish then.
Okay. So I'm just making obvious. Well, thank you so much for all the wonderful comments, and obviously we cannot address them. I would just like to take three quick ideas. First, I love this idea that we are understating the challenges. I think I totally follow you. Indeed, we are facing a radicalization, actually, of the reasons why we should care for these three principles. And so thinking about AI is actually the most important thing that we should do today, because it helps us see how clearly these are crucial challenges that are going to define the future of humanity, basically. So thank you for that. At the micro work experience level, I would say, I think I'd like to say that to engage with what Josh said, the intrinsic value of work, I think, is never going to be defined by the bounds of the democratization process, yet it is it's going to be determined by it, right? So I take your points as also engaging us with deepening the driving concerns here, and again, basically understating the challenges that we face. So thank you for broadening up, at the sort of micro and micro level, what we're trying to address in the book in a very insufficient way. The third point is about the connection with other core concerns, and I'm taking the inequality challenge that I think you very rightly raised. We do not defend the perspective in this book that democratizing work, decommodifying labor, and decarbonizing the planet through work is going to be enough to address the challenges that we face. We are just saying that this is a crucial part. It's a necessary condition, but it's not going to be sufficient. And I think even though the message might look very broad and very encompassing, it's certainly not our perspective that this is enough, sufficient, and you're totally right, and thank you for raising the connections with other dimensions of the moving pieces that have together be articulated so that we can shift to an economy that is sustainable and democratic. Thank you.
Does anyone want to add anything brief before we go for one more round of questions?
Just address the question about whether that's like a dichotomy to have a vibrant labor movement and workers on corporate boards. And I think you optimize those when they work together, right? Because the presence of a democratically or autocratic worker representation is going to give legitimacy and credibility to those representatives on the board. And I think there is, I can't cite it for you, but I think there is research that shows when you don't have that legitimacy, you can actually engender bad decisions by the board because there's a mindset like we can do whatever we want to do now because there are workers on the board, and look, they nodded when I said we should increase CEO pay, and the workers, they all nodded. But if they're not truly representing the workers and they don't have that legitimacy with their coworkers, then that very well may happen. I mean, if you have yes people, even if they're workers on the board, you're actually going to end up in a worse situation. So I think what you really want is a system, I mean, like co-determination, where those systems feed into each other.
So 3 very good points. First one, Hélène, I completely agree. Don't shoot the algorithm, right? It's key. But also, I think it's really, really important that we need to think about new mechanisms for agency and accountability precisely in order to ensure that, right? Because if we don't have those new mechanisms, then the whole thing is going to crumble. So it's not about saying shoot the argument, it's more so about actually rethink how we need to think about agency and accountability. In terms of Ashlyn's question, and this came out of Abby's economic analysis as well, one of the sort of genius approaches of the German model in terms of co-determination has been that actually formally trade unions and co-determination are completely separate. There are no formal links at all between union representation and workers on boards or even works councils. And that has taken a lot of the conflict out. Now, I also agree with Sharon that we need to have legitimacy, but you can have legitimacy through elections for works council amongst the workforce, completely independent of the trade union. And then just to be a bit provocative about your point about pleasure in work. You know, there's this meme about, choose a job you love and you'll never work another day in your life. One I came across recently is where the bottom bit is crossed out and it says, choose a job you love, and you spend the rest of your life in pain, worrying at all times about, every little detail about your job and never being able to let go.
What do you mean,
so just
pain?
It's a challenge. Just a challenge. if you're so deeply, if we're so deeply invested, are there any downsides to being so deeply invested in our jobs?
Well, there probably are downsides to being deeply invested in all love relationships. Was that your point?
I think we're going very dark.
Take note. Okay, so Milo and Mayan. Keep it brief though, Milo, if you could.
All right, great. So we've got some arguments that the firm should be democratized and the citizens of this democracy are workers. But I'm wondering how much the arguments just applied to the citizens of the democracy should be about anyone, or anyone who is affected, say, by the product that's being built. So just to take maybe 2, because I'll be quick, and not all 6 of the instrumental arguments that you gave, Hélène. So one is the epistemological argument. Kind of the more people you have in the room of different kinds, the more things that you'll see. So that's true not just of workers, but of everyone. And similarly, say, for the discrimination argument, if you have a broader kinds of representation, making decisions, you will, at least the thought goes, have less discrimination. Presumably that's going to hold both for workers and for people at large. So I guess the question, how much does that generalize, and is that a welcome conclusion? Of course, many people think, yeah, great, good to have more arguments that there should be things like design justice or participatory design on the scale of, corporate governance.
Maya.
Thank you so much. Just 2 questions, 2 things that you brought up that were interesting to me and I would like to hear a bit more about if you can. One, you talked about business schools and the ways things are being taught at the moment contribute to the problem, and that you think in the future there could be some changes in how we teach managers. So that's one question I have. So what are your thoughts about it? What kind of changes can be made? And you also hinted there that democratizing firms can also contribute somehow to the product. And you said something about, for instance, in algorithms, that intimate knowledge of different employees of the algorithm can help it make it better. So I also wonder if you can give examples, and I also think that I agree with this instinct and argument, and I think it could be something that to push more on in order to get people to agree to actually do it in different companies, because at the end, it's also about profit, and I do think that there is something for profit as well to democratize the firm.
And I'm going to add a third question from Andrew online. He's concerned about, from Alex online. He's concerned about the idea of a job guarantee. Wouldn't that lead to a situation where you could have had a service performed at a better level by machine learning algorithms, and instead it's performed by a human who does something inferior?
Okay.
3 minutes.
Well, just for me, right? No. So two points. For the democratization of firm, the perspective that we put forth is to democratize it through its labor investors, which means not everyone. It's a way to identify those who actually invest themselves in the production or the service. And that can actually go across the labor law qualification up to, for instance, users in Facebook, for instance, who are labor investing because they're producing what basically Facebook is selling. And so these are those who are governed by the rules and decisions of the firm. They are not impacted as consumers can be, or the communities around, etc. And I think we have to be very mindful today that capitalism is trying to reinvent itself as through stakeholder capitalism, and that is a way actually to embed workers in a whole network of impacted potential constituencies, which actually leaves capital investors in the driver's seats. So by thinking about labor investors, you can have their a way to distinguish. And on the job guarantee, just addressing that online question, the idea that Pavlina Cherneva certainly pushes for is the idea of meaningful, decent jobs, which actually are created based on the needs of the communities. So the job is federally funded, if we're talking about the United States, so centrally by the state funded, but not create a huge program to just create positions that are completely non-meaningful. These positions are created based on the needs of the people, the needs of the planet at that location. So there is a whole thinking about the interaction between the central funding and the local needs.
Okay, I think we have to stop there. And so I just want to thank the speakers, the commentators for this excellent discussion, and for everyone who participated both in person and online. Thanks so much.